In a small, dimly lit hut at the edge of a village, a young man named Thomas sat by the flickering flame of a humble fire. His hands trembled as he scraped his fingers along the wooden table, gathering the handfuls of dried maggots he had spent the last hour collecting from the decomposing tree stump out back. The smell was pungent, a stench he had grown used to, though it still made his stomach turn each time. Thomas had no other choice. His mother needed something to eat. His mother, Maria, had been blind for over 5 years now, and her health had steadily deteriorated since she fell ill with a fever that seemed to sap her strength. She lay on a small cot by the window, wrapped in thin blankets that no longer offered much warmth. Her body was thin, her bones almost fragile, and her once vibrant voice now weak, often nothing more than a hoarse whisper. "Do you need help, Thomas?" Maria's voice called out softly from the bed, her tone tired but filled with the love only a mother could show. "I've got it, Mother," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the anxiety knotting in his stomach. He knew what he was about to do wouldn't be enough to make her well again, but it was all he had. He walked quickly, boiling the maggots in a small pot of water over the fire, waiting for them to soften. His eyes kept darting over to Maria, who now lay still, the weight of her sickness pressing down on her fragile frame. She had always been strong. She had always been the one to provide, to nourish Thomas when he was just a boy, to offer him wisdom, comfort, and a sense of security. Now, he was the one who had to give back, even if it meant performing tasks that churned his stomach or forced him to dig deep into the earth for sustenance. A faint groan escaped his mother's lips. Thomas swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth, not wanting her to know how difficult the meal preparation was. "Mother, I'm going to bring you something. It's not much, but..." His voice trailed off as he spooned the mushy, soft maggots into a bowl. The sight of them made his skin crawl, but he knew she needed nourishment, and this was the only thing he could offer at the moment. Thomas stood up and carried the bowl toward the bed, sitting down beside her. Maria reached out, her hand trembling slightly, feeling for the bowl. She lifted it to her lips, trusting Thomas implicitly despite the strange texture and smell of the meal. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered, the words barely escaping her cracked lips. He watched her take the first bite, the last remaining part of her strength focused on swallowing what she could. He wanted to cry, but he didn't. Thomas had learned long ago that there were no tears in his world, only survival. His survival. Her survival. As the fire flickered and the night crept in, Thomas sat silently by her side, watching her eat the meal he had prepared. He wondered, for the first time in his life, if this was what he had been born for, to feed her, care for her, and witness the slow decline of the woman who had given him everything. Thomas would do anything for her. Even if it meant continuing this strange, miserable task of cooking maggots for her. He didn't care what people thought. They had their own lives, their own struggles. It was only him and his mother now. As he stood to leave the room, to prepare for the night, a sudden rustling noise startled him. The wind howled outside, but the sound that followed felt different. Something shifted in the air, and it made Thomas pause, his heart racing as he glanced back at Maria, still eating, her face drawn with exhaustion. The wind outside grew stronger, howling through the cracks in the walls as if it were trying to get inside. Thomas stood at the threshold of the small room, the firelight casting long shadows across the floor. His breath caught in his throat, an unexplainable unease crawling up his spine. He glanced over at Maria, her frail form still bent over the bowl, though she seemed distracted now. She was no longer eating but staring into the distance, her empty eyes gazing toward the darkened window. "Maria." Thomas called softly, his voice trembling with an emotion he couldn't quite place. She didn't answer. But that wasn't unusual. Since losing her sight, she often seemed lost in another world, a space where the outside sounds, the scents, and even the touch of things seemed to matter more than the actual moment. Thomas took a step forward, closing the gap between them. But as he did, something caught his attention. A shadow, dark and out of place, drifted past the window. It was the strangest thing, there had been no one outside. Thomas quickly rushed to the window and peered out, but the moonlight offered only the barest glimpse of the empty, windswept field surrounding the hut. Confused, He turned back to his mother, who now seemed even more distant, her head lowered. Her hands shook slightly, and her breath was coming in short, labored gasps. Thomas's heart sank. He had never seen her this way before, not even when her illness first started. "Maria," he asked again, his voice cracking as he knelt beside her. Slowly, Maria lifted her head, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. But there was something different about her expression, something almost eerie. Her gaze, still empty, seemed to focus on him with a strange intensity. "Thomas, you've been feeding me the wrong things," she whispered, her voice sounding foreign, colder than before. "You should have known better." Thomas recoiled slightly, his chest tightening with dread. His hand hovered over hers, unsure whether he should touch her. He had been the one who had taken care of her, doing everything he could to provide, to feed her. And yet, her words stung. "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked past him, her head tilting as though listening for something distant. The room felt unnaturally cold now, and the fire in the hearth sputtered, casting erratic shadows along the walls. Thomas's eyes darted nervously, unsure of whether to turn around or stay where he was. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness outside the hearth, sending a shiver down Thomas's spine. It was unlike any animal he'd ever heard before, deep, throaty, almost human. Maria's eyes widened slightly. She didn't look at Thomas anymore but seemed to sense something in the room, her hands gripping the edge of her bed tightly. "They are here," she murmured, her voice hollow. "You shouldn't have fed me that, Thomas, now they've come for me." Thomas's blood ran cold as he looked at her. This wasn't his mother speaking anymore, this was something else. Something darker. He backed away, slowly at first, then more rapidly, his mind racing. He tried to process her words, but they made no sense. What did she mean? What had he done wrong? His head was spinning, and the growl outside grew louder, closer. "Thomas," she called, her voice now almost a croon, almost seductive. "Come closer. I need you." But Thomas could only hear the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears as he stood frozen, the unease in his chest now swelling into something far worse, fear. The fire in the hearth went out in a sudden flash, plunging the room into an eerie darkness. And in that darkness, the growl outside seemed to grow, echoing now from all directions. Something was coming, something he couldn't see but could feel inching ever closer. His heart pounded in his chest as his eyes flicked between the darkened corners of the room and his mother's strange, unblinking gaze. The air felt thick, suffocating, and Thomas knew, with a terrible certainty, that whatever was outside, whatever was coming, had already found them. The growl outside intensified, a throaty sound that now vibrated the walls of the small hut, filling the space with a sense of impending doom. Thomas's breath was shallow, his mind racing for an explanation, for some way to save his mother, or himself. The night seemed to press in, the silence between each growl feeling like an eternity. But the strange, unholy atmosphere was not the only thing that unsettled him. His mother, her frail form still sitting upright in bed, now exhaled slowly, her lips curling into a slow, unnerving smile. "Thomas, come closer," she whispered again, her voice now deep and distorted, unlike anything he had ever heard from her before. "I need you. I've always needed you." Thomas's instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of the hut and into the open air. But his feet refused to move, glued to the floor as if an unseen force had paralyzed him. His mind flashed back to the maggots, the strange, disgusting meal he had prepared. Had it been some kind of curse? Some punishment for his desperation? Or was it something else, something older, something that his mother had been hiding all along? He looked back at her, and in that moment, he saw it. The faint outline of her shadow no longer resembled the sick, frail woman he had cared for. It was taller, darker, her form now riding unnaturally in the shadows. Thomas's heart thudded painfully in his chest. "No," he whispered, unable to tear his gaze away. "You're not my mother." The shadow of the figure before him grinned, and the voice that followed was not his mother's. It was something ancient, something full of malice. I was never your mother, Thomas. I only wore her skin. But I fed on her weakness, her fear, and now, I feed on you. Suddenly, the growl outside was no longer just a sound. A shape, indistinct but vast, loomed just beyond the threshold of the hut, its eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Thomas felt the air grow thick with cold, and the scent of decay, mingled with the rancid odor of maggots, began to suffocate him. Without thinking, Thomas lurched backward, knocking over a small stool, the clatter ringing in his ears. He had to leave. He had to get out. But as he turned to flee, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping him inside. The shadows shifted around him, and his mother, no, the thing that had once been his mother, leaned forward, reaching out with long, twisted fingers. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice now a chorus of whispers. "You belong to us." In that instant, Thomas realized the truth. He had been so desperate to care for his mother, to feed her, that he had failed to see the darkness that had overtaken her long ago. He had been blinded by his love, unwilling to recognize that sometimes, love could turn into something dangerous, something destructive. His mother's illness had not just been a physical ailment, but a manifestation of something far older and darker. By feeding her, he had unknowingly nourished the very thing that had taken over her spirit. He closed his eyes, his thoughts racing. There was one thing he could do. One way out. Thomas reached for the small knife hidden in his belt, the one tool that had always been by his side. With a deep breath, he turned toward the figure that had once been his mother and, for the first time, saw the fear in her eyes, the fear of being trapped in this monstrous form. "I'm sorry, Mother," he whispered, his voice barely a tremor. "But this is the only way." With trembling hands, Thomas plunged the knife into the shadowy form. The scream that followed was not human, a terrible wail that split the air as the figure writhed and dissolved into the darkness. As the last echo of the scream faded, the room grew eerily silent. Thomas collapsed to the floor, his heart racing. The fire was out, but the night was still, the chill gone. His hands, slick with sweat, gripped the knife, and his eyes darted to where his mother had been. The cot was empty, the bedclothes undisturbed. For a long moment, Thomas sat there, breathing heavily, wondering if he had dreamed it all. But then he heard a faint whisper, so soft he almost missed it. "Thomas." He turned quickly. The voice was weak but familiar. It was his mother, truly his mother, lying in the bed, her frail body shivering from the fever but free of the darkness that had overtaken her. She was still sick, but she was no longer a prisoner of the shadow. She reached out a trembling hand to him. "Thomas, is it really you?" Tears filled Thomas's eyes as he crawled toward her, wiping away the grime from his face. "Yes, Mother. It's me." And in that moment, he understood. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes, love, when taken to extremes, could blind a person to the truth. In his desperation to save her, he had been willing to feed something that was never meant to be nurtured. He had been driven by fear and guilt, not by wisdom. The true act of love, he realized, was not just in feeding and caring, but in seeing, understanding, and protecting what truly mattered. As he held his mother in his arms, Thomas promised himself that he would never again let fear cloud his judgment. Love, he knew now, was not just about sacrifice, it was about wisdom and balance. And the lesson he would carry for the rest of his life was this: true love sometimes means knowing when to let go, when to stop feeding the darkness, and when to face the truth, no matter how painful it may be. We have gotten to the end of this story. If you find this interesting, kindly like and subscribe to get more interesting stories like this.